We're going to get started here in just about a minute with Mark Miles. We're talking how to get your Amazon business started in the U.S., how to figure out how to sell on Amazon US when you are not a U.S. citizen, and fun things like that. So go ahead and join us now if you'd like to. sellroundtable.com/live, and we're going to get started here shortly. All right, here we go. I will hit record, I promise.
Okay.
All right, here we go. Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Andy Arnott with
Amy Weiss.
And this is Seller Roundtable number 107, and we're super excited to have Mark Miles on today. Mark, thank you, and thanks for being here, and welcome.
Absolutely. Glad to be here, Andy. Amy, thank you.
So, Mark, what we like to do to start out is to get a little bit of background on yourself, so you can give us kind of, as much or as little as you want, where you're born, where you live, where you grew up, school, hard knocks, past businesses, kind of anything you want to go into. We'd love to hear about it.
Okay, absolutely. So, yeah, I actually grew up several places around the world. Got my, 007 classification license. No, just kidding. But I actually did live over in several different places. I grew up in Europe and in Asia a bit. And I've always had a love for Asian culture and understanding of European culture. And always, you get a different perspective when you grow up a lot outside the United States. And that and the learning where I've been has given me, I think, a relatively unique opportunity to really understand where people are coming from, seeing other points of view, which has led to my whole desire to help people get to the goal they want to get to, rather than fitting them into a box and saying, here's what you have to do if you want to do X. I prefer to take what's your goal? Let me know. We'll find a way to help you get to it. And it's your goal. And you're going to make the decisions. I will give you advice. I will help you out, but you're going to make those decisions. So I went to law school. I went to college in Indiana, majored in Japanese studies, didn't continue it in law school. Mistake, I think, looking back on it. Went into tax instead. No one asked me why I thought tax would be more interesting in Japanese studies, but I did tax in law school and got my master's in tax because I said this stuff's complicated. I'm going to be advising people. I better learn a little bit about it. And so, I got a master's in tax. I worked for national security for 2 years because nobody wanted to hire someone straight out of law school with no experience, despite how much knowledge they knew. So I worked in international security for one of the largest international and medical security companies in the world. And then I went back into U.S. market as working for a CPA firm, doing a lot of tax issues, but also providing business services because they wanted business services. That kept working until my father died about maybe 16 years ago. And my mom was alone here in Florida. That was the opportunity to move down to Florida, get away from Pennsylvania where I was at the time. And for the last 15 years in Pennsylvania, I've just been sort of saying, who can I help down here? I'm in Venice, Florida. It's not exactly the metropolitan hubbub of current businesses. So it's made the business law practicing a little more challenging. But this COVID-19 that's impacted all of us has also given some of us opportunity to take. And my opportunity is now reaching out to international clients through my BNI, which is giving the platform to talk to people on Zoom and be able to go to Malaysia or Hong Kong or Germany and talk to people and give me a chance to expand to say, how can I help you when you want to work in the United States with Americans? As far as my background, I like to read, I like to play Japanese chess, I like to bicycle. Not that I've done much of that recently, that I should more. I do teach Taekwondo. My wife also teaches Taekwondo. And I like reading, playing games. That's usually what I do when I'm, not working or helping somebody. So
awesome.
There we go.
Love it. So, it sounds like, one of the things that's kind of your bread and butter is, helping overseas people, brands, and, I'm sure you work for big brands and probably smaller mom and pop type shops as well, who want to sell in the U.S., who aren't U.S. citizens or based in the U.S. So what are if somebody say for example in our Facebook group we have a lot of people from Pakistan. They just opened selling to people in Pakistan on Amazon US. So if somebody was trying to start their Amazon US business and they're from Pakistan, how could you help them? What would be some of the first steps to help them get
Okay.
into selling on Amazon?
Okay, so the first step actually before you even probably come to me is making sure whatever product or service that you have is able to be sold in the United States, especially through Amazon or any other US service. Because it's like, well, it's great. We have it online and we want to sell this product. Sorry, that's banned, no, then you're not going to be able to sell. Maybe you have a product that needs to be registered. You have to get appropriate permits from the USDA, or the, FDA. Maybe US Tobacco, Alcohol, and Firearms. Those are processes that I'm not familiar with. As an attorney, I don't actually deal with a lot of the government here. But the first is to see what it takes to bring your product. Can you bring your product here? What's the liability for doing so? What's the government regulation for doing so? And is your packaging compliant? And that's going to have to be done by somebody else other than me, because honestly, that's not what I do. You want compliant packaging. I mean, I can tell you a certain, legal liability waivers you want to put, on the packages some, but, as far as, complying with them, you have to comply with that. That's the first thing foremost. Number one is to say, what have you done to do that? If not, do we have people that I can put you in touch with that know that and can help get those answers? Number two after that is what's your budget? Because a lot of what you do is going to be depend on how much money you want to or can spend. If you have a lot of money, there's a lot more you can do. If you don't have a lot of money, you have to be very careful and decide what you're going to do with the product. And third is, are you only going to do Amazon or another online retail, or do you want to do something more that becomes, I don't know, what do we call it? Offline, hands-on, live.
Right. Brick and mortar.
Brick and mortar, yeah. Or
Yep.
even if it's just importing through, without actually a separate store, you can just import, product, and have representatives, marketing or selling it.
Sure. So that being said, do you suggest when you have like an overseas client, are you trying to help them get set up with things like trademarks, banking, kind of what are the pitfalls in terms of getting set up in the US, that because it seems like one of the biggest things that we see over and over again is like verification, right? People having to submit documents and bills and things like that. I mean, that's probably by far the biggest issue that I see with people trying to sell in the US. What are some suggestions that you can give in terms of making that process as simple and smooth as possible?
Okay, so one of the things is, regardless of what you legally can or can't do, of course, Amazon has certain rules. Each online retailer has certain rules. And they're going to want PayPal has certain rules, and they're going to want certain things. And you can either go through PayPal's rules, and maybe you need to, if they don't like it, maybe get an attorney who specializes in PayPal or Amazon appeals, like people do, to get an answer. If for some reason Amy somehow doesn't have the answer, which I'd be surprised if she didn't, but if she doesn't have the answer and you have to get an attorney, their rules are sort of their rules. The biggest problem you're going to find, which is the same thing when it comes to banking, is most places are requiring a social security number. An EIN number is not good enough to do. Now, if it's a foreign company, you demonstrate that to satisfaction, that might work. But most companies need to have want a social security number. If they want a social security number, you don't have a lot of options, honestly. One is to see, do you really trust somebody that you know in the United States? If they're a family member, friend, do you trust them, and are they willing to work with you? We can do whatever it takes to make it the quote legally part of any business entity, so they can use their social security number to provide it. I have Canadians who have used their son's social security number to get the access they've needed to do stuff in the U.S. because their son was willing to do it, and they obviously trust their son. You don't want to go out to some stranger, hey, who's got a social security number? I'll pay you $500 to let me use your social security number. It's not going to work very well. But the other problem with that is banking. So let's say you get set up and you actually want a bank account in the United States. That's really hard if you're overseas. Most banks are now not opening them for foreign residents, non-residents, sorry. Even more, even if they open them, in order to get us as a signer on the bank account, you need to come to the United States for almost all banks. So if you want a US bank account, you have to somehow find your way to the United States and find a bank that's going to let you be a signatory and open an account. Now, that pitfall is easier to fix. That one's much easier to fix. It just requires you having somebody that you can trust, like an attorney. And I say attorneys over anybody else for a very good reason, is most people that are setting this up are not dealing in tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. As an attorney, any attorney who's providing services like I do, what they know for and is like a company secretary, registered agent, bank accounts, can also be a person to assist that with the banks. Now, we have ethical rules that apply even when we're not acting as an attorney that follow in everything we do. So the difference that makes attorneys from everybody else is your $25,000, your $50,000 doesn't matter compared to my license. I could care less. I'm not doing anything, to risk my license for your $25,000. I'm sorry, it's not worth it. So if you have an attorney, you have a lot better sense of security that the person is going to do what they want, a little more trustworthy. And I even write into language, certain language into documents that prevent me from doing something that would, without approval. So there's ways to do around that. You have to be, it comes down to, do you have somebody you can trust to do that? Social security number is harder. I'm not going to, even if you're my client, I'm not giving you my social security number just to anybody to use on a form for PayPal. It's not happening. That is going to be one of the harder things. You're going to have to go through their regulations and rules and see what it is they can do. There's really not much you can do about that unless you have someone else give you a social security number.
Right. That's a really interesting take on, a view on a different way that you could get set up in the US is knowing somebody with a social security number and working with them. What I would love to understand, there are many different types of attorneys, right? There are patent attorneys and trademark attorneys, and you are more of a general business attorney. And so can you explain why business owners should have a general business attorney, and what kinds of things that you do for business owners?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that. So one of the things, yes. So attorneys by nature, when they're licensed to practice in any state they're licensed to practice in, can practice any type of law other than patent law, which has its own separate bar, and maybe a couple others I may not be aware of, specialty items that you can't practice. Obviously military, we can't do either. But basically, if it's anything from, criminal to civil to business to tax to divorce, we can do so by nature of as an attorney. You probably don't want someone who can do all of those, because you could, jack of all trades, master of none is not a good thing in the legal world. And so what I do as a business attorney, the biggest thing I help people understand is to avoid the headaches, pit traps, and the legal risks that you take by not doing things right. And here's a great example. I have a friend who is on a Facebook group in Naples called Living and whatever it is, people in Naples. And someone said, I need an attorney to form an LLC. And all these people are like, oh, you don't need to form an attorney to form an LLC. Just go online and do it. It's not the practice of law. You can do it. And I didn't join, I'm not a member of the group where I said something. They're correct. Technically, to go onto the website of any state you're in and form an LLC, you do not have to have a law license to do so. You can do it. Trained monkey can do it if you tell them the right information. The problem is people say, I have an LLC, therefore I'm protected. No, most people form a business entity like an LLC for one of two reasons: tax or asset protection, liability protection. If you form an LLC by yourself and you think you have asset protection, you're wrong. There are things you can get with it, but it also may not be the best example. Maybe you form the LLC because you're told that's the best thing. Then you find out that maybe, for example, in Canada, LLCs aren't treated the same way and you've got a lot more tax that you're going to pay. Or it's treated somewhere else in your own home country because you formed an LLC, and that may not have been the right entity. You may also, you have options to choose. You don't realize you have to choose. If you don't choose, the government defaults certain things to you. Same thing. One of the examples will be Florida. If you form an entity in Florida, you have to have an operating agreement. Every LLC across the United States statute in every state has an LLC agreement. This is very powerful. You can do almost what you want as long as you don't go past certain minimal thresholds. Absent that, you can run it the way you want. If I want to make Amy dress up in a purple monkey suit in order to get her money every week, I can do it. Not a problem. I'm not going to recommend that necessarily.
Me neither.
Exactly. But it's just to show what you can do. If you don't do that, if you don't have an attorney to do that, you don't not know what you're missing. You may have opportunities you have missed, and you may open yourselves up to a lot more legal headache you could have easily avoided. And I don't care who you are, paying maybe $1,000 for a good liability insurance policy that could save you tens of thousands of dollars in a lawsuit. It's probably a good idea to do. But if you don't know,
Right. When I was first setting up my company, I was going to the Small Business Development Center here in San Antonio to learn more about setting everything up and doing everything right. They don't exactly cover all of those P's and Q's in college. So I was just learning, okay, I'm here in Texas. I'm trying to set up an entity. What do I need to know? And we had an attorney, a business attorney like you, come and talk. And one of the key takeaways and the reason that I hired him to draw up my paperwork was two reasons. One, what you mentioned already, that there might be things that I don't know, right? The other thing is about partnerships and the entity structure. And we're going to get into that more. I have a question about that later, but that's the thing is I didn't even know, like, I thought I should just list my husband on my LLC paperwork. And he was like, no, you don't. It has nothing to do with your marriage being solid. He's like, it's a nightmare if anything were to happen. So just having that legal counsel was so great. And I think I paid a few $100s, and it was for the time to ask all the questions, for them to draw everything up. And it's just so nice knowing. The other thing is to understand what I need to do to be legal. So for example, certain states require that your operating agreement or your notes, you have to take like an annual meeting notes, and those have to be on file. And if you were to get sued, and they could basically, if your company isn't found to be legitimate because you haven't kept up with those requirements, the attorney explained to me that if you were to get sued and you're not keeping up with those requirements, your company could be found illegitimate, and then that could fall on your own personal. You could personally get sued, and then what you think is protected, oh, my home is protected, my car is protected, this is all under the protection of an LLC, right? Well, not if that LLC is found to not be legitimate or you haven't done what you're supposed to do. So in my experience, that's why a business attorney is so important, just to understand, like, hey, what am I doing? And am I saying these things the right way and keeping up with my business the way that I'm supposed to? So I would love to ask you, Mark, as my business is growing, right? So yes, I hired a business attorney to help me understand, to get my LLC set up, all of that. As my business is growing, what are some considerations that I have to reduce my risk?
Okay, so again, this is America, whichever state you're in. So which means if you're going to agree with somebody, put it in writing. We all know what happened in Jerry Maguire. Yes, my word is my bond. We saw where that ended up for him. So put it in writing. I don't care if it's your friend. I don't care if it's your neighbor. I don't care if it's your dad. I'm sorry. You're going to put it in writing when it relates to the business. And when you do it, you're going to come and say, okay, we're putting it in writing. What are my risks here if this doesn't happen? Because I tell people, when people look over, I get people all the time, they send me a contract and say, can you look it over? I'm like, sure, I can look it over, but tell me what your concern is. Because if you could give a darn about whether or not you can place a parking sign here, I don't have to worry about the parking language. You know, if you're concerned about whether the air conditioning is covered as a replacement, then fine, I can look at that. But you have to have a concern. So that's what we're here for, is what is your concerns that you have? Those need to be addressed. Now, if there's something blatant or something relatively big, I'll mention something that you didn't mention. That's fine. Yeah, we'll give you that extra. But we start with, what are you concerned about first? And then answer those, because a lot of things have to be drafted specifically to meet those requirements. That's something that I love to do. It's one of the reasons I do what I do, is that I tell people, if you can think it, I can put it in writing, as long as it's legal. It'll hold up. So you come to me and say, here's what I want to do. Here's what I'm concerned about. Yes, we can fix that in writing. Okay. And then if you've missed something big or common, no attorney can catch everything. And we think about things. There are going to be some things that are more remote than, but things change. A lot of times we didn't really think that a pandemic qualified. Does that qualify as force majeure for a contract? And force majeure is one of those provisions that says, if it's out of control of us, basically in the hands of God, a meteor strike, major fire, stop something, we're released from the contract. We don't have to perform. It really wasn't anybody's fault.
Right.
So unless you rooted for the Patriots, in which case, then that's your fault, it's punishment. But that's outside of that, pandemics weren't included necessarily. Now, you need to be more specific about that. And that's the thing that kicks in. So it changes. It's not the same from 20 years ago. So you have to have concerns when you deal with somebody. We have to put those in writing to alleviate those concerns and to protect you. So that's one of the biggest things when going, forward. The other is taxes, of course. Anytime you do something, there's probably going to be tax implications. And you need to have a good CPA with you that you can have. Even better is you have a CPA that will talk with your attorney so that we can go back and forth. Because a lot of times there's tax advantage to things that don't necessarily are not as good or conflict with the legal protections that you're getting. And sometimes you have to give up certain things. You can't always have your cake and eat it too, no matter what people say or no matter what you see. So sometimes if you want this tax advantage, you're going to have to give up this protection. Not always, and not necessarily so much. And some things you're like, fine, I don't care. I'll give that up in a heartbeat. Not a problem. But you want to have that information to weigh those decisions. So those are the things, whenever you deal with somebody, you want to bring in a partner, deal with somebody, even hiring an employee or something, what's my concern that hasn't been addressed? And if I can't address it, you've hired 5 employees, maybe you want an employee handbook done by a labor law lawyer. Can I look over one? Yes. Am I the best person to draft one? No. Go see an attorney. So those are just, anytime you come up with somebody else involved, do things need to be in writing? That's really when you call, that's when you call me. Say, okay, right. I've got a concern. Can we put it in writing?
Give me some legal counsel about the validity of a contract between 2 people. So speaking, or 2 businesses. So speaking of contracts between 2 people, can we talk about partnerships? Because there are many Amazon sellers that get into e-commerce and they want to start a private label brand, and they're wondering, and I get this question all the time, what should I consider in terms of working with somebody else? And should I take on a partner? I know in private label, I often have to remind people that the payoff is in the exit more than, in the day-to-day with private label. So partnerships, they should really consider what is your profitability and what does your partner want to take out of the business? How immediately do they want to take money out of the business? What are your expectations? But there are so many considerations for partnerships. So can you talk a little bit about key legal considerations for forming partnerships?
Yes. So the first thing actually is not necessarily a legal one, is what type of partnership are you looking at? You either have somebody who's coming in that's going to be involved in the business on a day-to-day or even month-to-month and be actively involved and wants to obtain money from it and share in the revenue as it grows, versus somebody who's coming because they want to invest, and you've heard the term silent partner, where they're like, hey, I'm going to invest in, I want X amount of money back. I'll take my payout on the back end. I'm fine with that. I just want this, and I'm going to get it before anybody else does. So you have to decide They both have their own pitfalls and concerns. So when people talk about partnership, are you working together with somebody to say, hey, you've got some expertise, I have expertise, you have some money, I have some money, let's work together? Or are you saying, hey, I've got this cool idea, I need, $100,000, dollars from, a private investor, and we need to create this quote partnership. The latter one, first of all, you're not going to want what's called a partnership. They're going to want equity in your entity. And there's no real entity called a partnership. It exists for tax purposes. And yes, you can file in a lot of states, you can file a general partnership. So I take it back that you can file a general partnership, but it really doesn't do much as far as an entity. And you can't really, trying to have the ownership is really tough. So they're going to want something more substantial. They're going to want to be invested in it. And that terms of whether it's an LLC or a corporation, however, those terms can fall into what people call a partnership. You're in partner with somebody, whether it's a corporation, and those terms have to be negotiated. And that's where you need an attorney to figure out, to ask you the questions. Well, how much are you willing to give up to get this now? If I get 100,000, I'll give up 10%. I want 1 million, okay, I've got to give up 50%, and those terms are negotiable. What you really need to do is make sure you have an attorney for that on your side, because these investors are pros at doing it. They know exactly what to ask for, and they can ask for more, and you need to understand what it is. I've heard a few stories of people saying, I lost my company. It's because you didn't understand what you agreed to when they lent you the money. If you don't like the money on those terms, don't borrow it. So that's a more specific area. That's a matter of making sure you keep control of your company. You don't give it away. When do they get paid? The more other partnership you're thinking about is when the people bring somebody in, like, I want to work with this person. So my question is, before you work with this person, do you trust this person enough to give them the keys to your house, the keys to your car, and to take care of your wife and kids if something happens to you? The answer is no. You may want to reconsider going to business with this person in a true partnership. Nothing says you can't work together with somebody. The lawyers have a wonderful model called eat what you kill. You work together, what you bring in is yours, minus shared expenses, and go. That's fine. That's not a problem. We're really not truly partners. In a true partnership, you both have put in something, it may not have been defined. The money comes into the partnership, expenses are paid, and the remaining is split pursuant to your partnership agreement as the percentages. And you both have an ownership in this business. So now that you have an ownership in the business, what happens if somebody wants to leave? What if somebody doesn't pull their weight? What if somebody dies? All those things are the biggest things. The biggest things I tell people for a partnership. This person has access to your money or to the money in the bank account. Yes, we all know there are legal recourses, but if you have to sue, that means that something, you didn't do a lot of protection sometimes ahead of time that you should have. What if they die? What if they have, family members? What if they have legal issues? And what are expectations? If someone thinks they're just going to invest money and sit back in the office all day and not do any work, and the other person thinks it's supposed to be working, that's going to be a problem. But if you have to write everything into the agreement, which you can do in most states, you have to consider, do you really want to go in business if I have to micromanage everything in writing? So I strongly suggest this, go see an attorney before you start. They'll ask you questions, make sure you agree. And if you agree, then great, okay, move forward with the help of an attorney. And I've heard people say, well, my partner and I have been together for 10 years, or it's my wife, we're husband and wife, we've been together for 20 years. And like, we're not going to change. I'm like, what happens if they get dementia? What happens if they get Parkinson's, unfortunately? They're not the same person. They can't make the same decisions. Now you've just handicapped yourself, and prevented yourself from moving forward, because of this. So I'm not saying it's wrong to do so, but these are all things, you're right, that you have to consider when going into partnership. Is the trust factor is number one. What happens if the person dies? What happens if the person, gets sick or is incapable? Or what happens if the person wants to leave? What happens if the person doesn't do their job, doesn't pull their weight? Those are the things that all have to be addressed.
Those are all great points, Mark. So one of the things that I would love to talk to you about, because I've had multiple lawyers and CPAs and things like that throughout the years, and I swear I get different opinions from everyone.
I'm sure you probably have.
Yeah, and so I mean, law is everybody thinks law is just such a cut and dry thing, and same thing with taxes, but it's just like anything, just like selling on Amazon. There's a lot of uh, confinement, but it's also a lot of art and interpretation and so much other things. And depending on who you go to, they're going to give you different advice. So I would love to hear
Correct.
from you in terms of when people go to form an LLC or a corporation for their business, specifically since we're e-com here. Generally, for an e-com business, should they do a C corp? Should they do should they do an LLC and then be taxed as an S corp? I mean, what formation type do you think is ideal? And I know that it's not cut and dry for every situation. So if you could give me maybe some examples on why you would use an S corp over a C corp or vice versa, I would really love to hear that.
Okay, no problem. So the first is for almost any non-resident person, you're not going to make an S corp, because in order to make the S election, you have to be a U.S. resident, permanent resident, or a U.S. citizen. So if you want to be any sort of owner in this entity and you don't reside in the United States lawfully, forget it. You're not doing an S corporation because you're not eligible. So that means you either form a corporation that's treated as what they call a C corp, or you form an LLC and you make the election to be treated as a C corp, a sole proprietor, or a partnership. There's three different ways you can choose to be, or an S corp actually could be taxed as that too. So the basic question is going to be, assuming you can do each, is a comparison of the tax rates between the two countries. Because if you form a C corporation in the United States and it's under regular rules, its net profit is 21%. That's the tax, end of story. Now, you may say, well, that's 21%. When I take the money out, I'm going to pay more tax on it. Yes, you are. Now, if you live in a jurisdiction that has 70% personal income tax, ooh, this 21% looks really nice leaving in there for 3, 4, 5 years, a bit that I don't need to survive on and use it later on. If you're in a 10% tax bracket, that sort of sucks. You don't really want it. So the other, besides just the tax rates between the two, because you have to add, what tax am I going to pay in the country I'm in? What tax am I going to pay in the US? And yes, you can get credits for stuff in the US against your home tax, but if your tax rate's lower, you're going to lose out on those credits. If your tax rate's higher, you can gain some. You have to compare those, look at a US tax treaty, because what people don't understand, it's not just the tax amount ultimately at the end, it's what's called a withholding tax. And the US has a rule that says if it's non-US real property and you make a payment to a non-resident alien, unless you come under one of the rare exceptions, you must withhold 30% of what you're paying. And that's not a tax due, that's just a, hey, we're holding this to make sure you file your individual income tax return with the US government. And if you don't owe that tax, you'll get it back next year. So that's 30%. There's a lot of tax treaties that will reduce or eliminate that. For example, in Italy, if you just choose to make a C corporation, then it's a corporation for both countries' purposes, that dividend goes down to, that withholding goes down to 5%. That could be huge, especially in cash flow going on. So you have to have both a tax treaty and a knowledgeable CPA to make the decision to compare what's the tax in both countries. That's really what's going to decide 99% of what entity you're forming when you're an overseas person. US person, slightly different story. US person like you, if you want to do another business, it's going to depend on your other income, how much income you're expected from this business, what's your threshold for making money, what you need to do with this money to live on or not live on, whether you're going to make an election to be treated as an S corporation or a regular corporation. The other thing that's problem with it, individuals and partnerships, like an LLC as a partnership, is there's an extra tax in the United States. It's called self-employment tax. So if everybody else is aware, when you work for a company and they pay you a W-2, you work as an employee, you have Social Security and Medicare withheld from your paycheck. And your employer pays half of that, you pay half. When you're self-employed, meaning you have a partnership or treated as a partnership or sole proprietor, you pay all of that, 15.2%. And that's in addition to income tax. And the only thing that reduces it are your business expenses or any after-tax credits, such as the earned income tax credit, the that you might be able to get on an individual basis. So if you're that, because that's when you decide this S election or not is appropriate for US. It is complicated. It's not the best answer, but for non-US residents, you're not forming an S corporation. You really have to take a look and say, what's the overall tax? Am I going to pay 70% tax or 50% tax? Because from a business protection side, they're all going to be you can get the business protection with both an LLC and a corporation the same in terms of dealing with the outside customers, etc. It's internally and taxes that's really the big kicker there.
Awesome, thank you. That's a great explanation. I did not realize that an S corp is not a good option for somebody overseas. So that's great advice, especially for those listening that are not from the U.S. or have U.S. citizenship. One of the things that you hear a lot of, and especially if you're a fan of like Rich Dad Poor Dad and you've run through a lot of his books, is the concept of piercing the veil, right? So that's if you can explain to people who've never heard of what that phrase means, and also after explaining, giving a little bit of background on it, maybe ways to protect yourself from somebody coming after you. We talked about it a little bit earlier.
Yep. Yeah, we did. And that's what I was mentioning when people said they felt protected. And Amy specifically mentioned that the reason she hired him was to make sure that, she wasn't personally liable for everything. Because that's one of the whole points is if something goes wrong in the business, you're not going to be liable. Now, if you happen to be the person doing the business and you do something like, okay, I'm going to get drunk and drive for my business and crash into a school bus. Yeah, I'm sorry. It may not matter what, your corporation's probably not protecting you. But the general rule for piercing the veil is if you act on behalf of an entity, then any liability for something that turns out to be wrong or a court holds to have been wrong is taken care of by the company, and it stays with the company. So you manufacture a product and you buy a bad raw material from somewhere that turns out to be, poisonous, as a product that people can put into their mouth, and you get 5 people, saying, hey, your product caused my baby to go to the hospital, because you had a different batch of raw material you put into the product. Yeah, you're going to get a bunch of lawsuits over that. And there's not going to be $5,000 lawsuits. So what you want to say is, worst case scenario, if something dreadful happens, I can walk away from this business, but my house, my car, my personal bank account, all my personal stuff is protected, and I don't have to worry about that if the business goes. Whatever I invested, I lost it, so be it, if need be, but I'm okay. That is what people expect. Piercing the corporate veil is when they, like I said, they go right through it like a knife through hot butter, and then they go after you personally and say, you owe us. And that's the biggest scare. And that's what I said by people that just going on and forming the LLC at the state Department of State webpage for your state doesn't give you that protection. And yes, there are some things you can do on a personal level to protect in assets, but that only works in some states. And when you have a place like Texas, which is a community property state, is a whole other story, on how you can do that. You have certain limitations sometimes. So you don't want to get to that point. Absolutely. So every state has a little bit of difference with what they will allow. But generally the rule, there's 2 hardcore rules, no matter what state you're in, that you need to do. If you violate either of these 2 rules, expect somebody to be able to pierce your corporate veil like there's no tomorrow. Rule number 1, do not commingle business and non-business funds. If you have started a separate entity, it has its own bank accounts. It pays for only business expenses. You only deposit business income. Now, we understand small business. Sometimes you have to put money into a small business. Sometimes you can take money out from a small business if things are good. You can do that. That's not a problem. You just have to transfer the money to yourself. If it's online, transfer business personal. Call it, shareholder, owner, whatever, and let the CPA classify it as appropriate and let them know so you're not surprised at the tax year or that you make some improper distributions. But you can take money out and you can put money in yourself. What you can't do is pay for your personal items through the business. Oh, 4 of us are going out to eat this weekend. Okay, let me put it on the corporate card. Yeah. we're actually going to go fly to Puerto Rico for a vacation. Let me put on the corporate card. No, that's called commingling. You're paying for personal stuff and the same. Nothing says you can't take the money out, pay yourself, and then use your personal card. But no, commingling, not keeping any separate records, like not having that bank account saying, well, it's the same bank account I do all my personal out of it. That's almost like death sentence. That's like lawyers can, any litigation lawyer is going to salivate getting that type of case. That's number one. Funds are not commingled. Number two, adequate capitalization, meaning if somebody is going to sue the company as a separate entity, there has to be some sort of expectation that they can get something. You'll hear a lot of people saying, well, I have no insurance, I have nothing because they can't get anything in my company. Well, that's number two, when they're most probably going to go right past through it and go to you. Because if you're operating in business, you're expected to be able to cover something that's reasonable. What's reasonable? Depends on what you're doing. If you're manufacturing woolen mittens that you knit yourself, what's the worst case your woolen mitten's going to happen? Someone gets a little scratchy because they're allergic to wool and didn't read? Okay, what's that going to be worth? Maybe a couple $1,000s at best. You don't have to have a whole lot. You manufacture nitroglycerin, you probably need a lot more because the risk is going to happen if something goes wrong. Boom. And actually, that's a bad example because there's something called strict liability, and when you work in those areas, you're sort of toast no matter what if something goes wrong. But if you have a part with lots of pieces that you have to manufacture, if any of those pieces break off and go into, it can be swallowed by a kid, or is poisonous or causes a problem, or the part breaks and therefore the whole machine itself doesn't work properly. What happens if the machine has, intricate sawing capability, and when the parts you manufacture ends up breaking, the saw causes the saw to cut through somebody or something. All of those are those risks. And you have to understand what's a reasonable risk for what you do. They have to be able to recover. Now, if you have tons of money in the corporate bank account, you have tons of equipment, that's probably good enough. The problem is they take it all, you now have absolutely nothing whatsoever. One of the things you can do to help prevent that is to buy liability insurance and make sure you follow everything they say. Tell them exactly what you do. Don't lie to the insurance company. Don't try to cut it short. Make sure you tell them everything you do. And when you change, you let them know and you answer the questions honestly, because it's so easy for insurance companies not to honor their policy if you violate the rules. One example being several contractors, they have a policy that says if you use a subcontractor, you have to make sure they have proper insurance. Well, if they don't, we charge you a higher deductible. So your $5,000, your $1,000 or $5,000 deductible now has gone to $25,000 because you didn't do what you were supposed to do. But if you do what you're supposed to do and you get this insurance for liability, that's considered an asset. That's got reasonable recovery. That will help reduce big time. Those two are the most critical. You have those covered, it's going to be pretty hard to go through after those two. What Amy mentioned earlier about having these minutes or these notes, etc. So that's treating it as a separate corporation. That's when you keep notes of what you do as a shareholder, because you're acting basically as a fiduciary. If you were handling your mom's money, you're not going to say, I'm going to make every single decision on my own and not say a thing. And I'll just go to Atlantic City every week. No, you're probably not, because you're under a duty. Same thing to a corporation. If you're going to make a big decision, document it. This is what we're going to do. If you have more than one partner or shareholder, make sure both of you have discussed it and you've done it. Because if you don't, then you got, partner issues. But if you create the separate bank account, create the entity, new number, letterhead separate, and treat it as separate, and you have your operating agreement and your resolutions, it's not necessarily going to be in and of itself. But if you ever have to go to court and the judge is like, okay, you've done this, and judge, here's all the written stuff we've done showing that everything is in the corporate name, having that there may just tip the difference to say, hey, you're treating this seriously, like you should, and you weren't. So it's important to have those corporate trappings, as we call it, in place, but they're not nearly as important as the first two. Those two things I gave you, failure to do those, I will almost guarantee you that they're going to go through the United States. I don't care what state you're in, they're going to go through that corporate veil.
Yeah. So that was great. I'm glad that you ended in the documentation thing, because with some of the people that we're working with right now, and I've heard this from so many other people, no matter what it is, it's like if you're having a dispute with your neighbor and their dog's taking a dump on your front yard, if you document what time, and you know what I mean, like the documentation is so important, because if you don't have that documentation, then it's a he said, she said kind of thing. And usually, correct me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of times that's the plaintiff is at a better better standing, because they're the one who's bringing the complaint, and if you can't prove them otherwise, that's a no.
No. So generally, rules, if you want to bring something, the burden of proof is on you to prove it as a rule. So if you're going to say this person did or didn't do something, the burden of proof is on you who's bringing it to do it. So you're actually, if it's hard, the problem is if you don't have much and the other person doesn't have much and you're living up to a judge, it's like a coin flip. It's like, okay, you know what? We didn't document this. Who's the judge going to believe? Does he believe you or does he believe the other person? And it's a matter of fact. So the judge in these cases operates as a fact finder. And if he finds as a fact the other person's more believable than you, it's not a lot of appeal to that, like there is on the law. The judge ruled wrongly. Judge made a fact finding determination. Absent something egregious like the guy admitted later, I committed perjury and I didn't say this. It's hard to overrule that. So anytime first of all, going to a judge is risky no matter what, anytime you go to a lawsuit. But the more you document, the more happy lawyers are willing to settle when you have more stuff. So if you're going to minimize costs, minimize the risk, document everything. And one of the biggest things in corporations is, let's say you're the managing partner, you run most of the day-to-day operations, and you have 3 partners who have like 3% each. And you fail to do the proper resolutions when you decide to take out an SBA loan or an EIDL loan, or you decide to put some money in because it needs to get going, and you do it on your own. Now what? Now you've taken action, even though you may have had the right in voting to do so, because it's over, you've now violated some of the statutes, the corporate rules on what you can and can't do. And now if something goes up, it's a breach of duty, you don't have documentation. Well, it clearly says X and you didn't do X. It's hard to defend against that one when they don't even have to prove it, because it says you shall not and you didn't, or and you did, which they no longer have to prove it. They just have to show that it was done. Now it's on you.
Interesting. So, in terms of, I'm kind of switching gears here now, but,
Sure.
if you're working with somebody overseas, they come into Amazon, they build a fairly sizable Amazon business in the US, and they say, hey, I want to sell the business. How could you help somebody in that position? And what are some of the considerations to think about if somebody who's not a US citizen is trying to sell a US based company, specifically for e-com?
Okay. Actually, it's really not a whole lot of differences that you would with anybody else in selling a business. They're relatively minor, the differences, because basically you're going to say, all right, how much am I getting for this? And what are the terms? People don't realize you can negotiate terms all day long on what you get or how you get. The biggest thing with that people forget is people often buy a business on small amounts and like, oh, we'll pay you a percentage of recurring, or of revenue. Well, you need to secure that. What happens if you don't get that revenue? What happens if you don't get that money? You need to secure. Anytime you don't get full cash down and you're either carrying a note back or you're getting paid on a percentage or residual or something, you need to make sure that's secure. And where I can help is say, okay, let's make sure that that is secure. Here's the things you have to consider when you're selling the business. Here's the possible terms you negotiate. It's not a legal thing, but have you thought about doing this? No, I hadn't thought about that. Okay, let's see what we can get for the business. And if you come to me early enough, I can refer you to somebody else that says, hey, maybe if you cannot increase your revenue anymore, but we can do more in the business so that instead of getting 2 times revenue, maybe you'll get 3 times revenue or 4 times revenue. So the biggest thing, one, is if you know you're going to sell your business, start preparing early. If you want to sell your business a couple years beforehand, say, here's where I want to sell. Come to me and say, let's take a look at this and see what we need to do and set up the time frame. If you have to sell, you are under so much worse in conditions on what you accept than if you're ready to sell. So first thing I'm going to say is come to me earlier than you think you are to make sure you're in a good position. Second, what are you going to do about funding if you're not getting paid up front? If you're getting paid cash up all up front, really not much of a concern as much. At that point, you're like, okay. Now, the other thing is, of course, when you buy a business, there's two ways to buy it: asset purchase or sale purchase. Sorry, stock or unit purchase. Asset purchase, they buy all your assets. You let them use the name. You shut down your entity. They form their entity. There we go. Stock purchase, they actually purchase your stock outright. They buy your whole company, stock, everything in it. And there's people like, why would you ever do that? If you're in an online Amazon business, you probably won't. But there are certain businesses where there are contracts or licenses involved where you can't really do it under the state law unless you purchase the ownership of the entity itself. So there are reasons to do so. And if it's an asset purchase, here's one of the biggest things: is you have to file your U.S. tax return at the end. So you have to know how much you're going to gain on this. And one of the things people forget is the IRS has a rule. It says anybody worldwide that sells a business in the United States, or if you're a U.S. citizen selling a business worldwide, you must report how you break up the money. So if I buy business from you, Andy, for $100,000, we have to break it up. All right, $10,000 to furniture, $10,000 to inventory, $50,000 to goodwill, $10,000 to a non-compete. Now, most of that doesn't have a big tax effect. A couple of those items can have a huge tax effect. So not knowing what you're agreeing to when you have to allocate, and the IRS says you will submit an allocation form. So if you don't do it, they're going to come back at you. And if both of you submit a form independently and those numbers are different, guess what? IRS is going to come back and say, let's take a look at your numbers. If you want to agree, you have to agree ahead of time. And if you don't know what you're doing there, you risk large amounts of tax effects, to do. So just by the warning of that, to work with the CPA and let you know what you're missing, that's the other thing that you can do as a sale. The only other thing is potentially as a foreign business, understand that they may withhold 30% of the proceeds. So if you need this money for your mom's hospital, don't necessarily expect that the full amount is not subject to withholding that you're going to get back next year. So that's really the biggest thing plus of course your tax you're going to pay in the US, but generally as a rule, the capital gains tax right now is relatively cheap and is usually less than most other places. Not always the case. So that's really it. I mean, not much difference for foreign non-US companies other than those tax considerations.
Some of those are great tips, though. All right, what I'd like to ask at the end here, Mark, is you said that you're into like reading and listening, and watching TV, things like that. What are anything that you're currently listening to, watching, reading that has made a big impact in your life in terms of business, personal, anything that's really catching your attention right now?
Okay, well, most of the time when I read, because I have to do all this reading for work, when I read, I want to read stuff that's feeds my brain. I don't want to think. When I go to read, I'm reading translated Chinese novels, I'm reading Westerns, I'm reading sci-fi, I'm reading fun stuff that I don't have to think about, just spoon feed me. But I have noticed that as a member of BNI, there have been some great people that have talked to BNI that aren't part of BNI that have done some amazing things. And, several of the books Dr. Meisner found in BNI has written have been several other people that he's co-authored with. The book Who's in Your Room is something that's really, really something important. And the basic premise is you have a room. You are the doorkeeper. You can let anybody you want into the room. Whoever you let in will never leave. From a business standpoint, which I was first written, who do you want in your room? From a living standpoint, your friend, who do you want in your room? That's one of the most, very powerful, very limited things that I have heard and seen. That book, Who's in Your Room? It's really not a big book. It's not very long. It is great. Another book, probably not necessarily for individuals, but if you work for a company or work with a company, there's a book called Scrum, Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. And I don't know how much the author really knew about rugby when he wrote it, because he used the rugby term, but the book's amazing about what to do and basically avoiding the inaction of trying to get something started and not doing it. It's a phenomenal book. Those are things. And then one more thing, the last one I went took it. I just got some information. I'm going to do some more on this. Because I don't remember the author's name because I blanked on Profit First. is the name of
Mike
the book.
McAllowitz. Yeah, we've
Thank
actually
you,
had him
yes.
on the show on the podcast.
Have you?
Yeah.
Awesome.
He's one of our
The
favorites.
concept behind it is an awesome concept.
Yep.
I'm sort of sad to say I just found out about it last week through the PI National
Yeah.
Convention. So,
Yeah, he's got a bunch of good ones. Yeah, Profit First is great. And then he has Clockwork, the Toilet Paper Entrepreneur. I mean, he's got a bunch. And yeah, he is one of the best authors because number one, if you listen to the audio version, he's hilarious. He's a really funny guy. And number two, a lot of these kinds of books where, people are trying to teach people processes and, accounting, it goes over people's heads and there's not really any actionable, anything actionable that comes along with the book. Whereas Mike has a ton of resources, printouts, things where you can actually take what he's teaching and put them into practice. And really, for somebody who's not, it doesn't have an MBA can actually go through it and kind of learn it and understand it. So yeah, that's I'm glad that you agree in the premise where Amy and I, we're a huge fanboy and girl with Mike McAllowitz. He's a stud and great.
I'm going to become a bigger fan.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
I mean, it does make it easy to access as opposed to thinking like, how do I do all this downloaded and put it in place? You're so right.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Mark, thank you so much for being with us. If you're listening on the podcast, we really appreciate when you guys rate, review, subscribe. We keep growing every single month. I keep looking at our stats and seeing that you guys are really listening and enjoying. We're growing all over the world. So I really, really appreciate that, guys. Thank you so much for listening in. We really appreciate it. If you haven't done so yet, please join us live every Tuesday, 1 p.m. Pacific time, sellerroundtable.com/live. You can jump in here with the meeting. We're going to end the recording and the live. So we do what we call extra innings, where we sit and kind of do a quick little 5 to 15 minute talk where you can ask our guest questions, you can ask us questions, and it doesn't get recorded or pushed out. So it's just in a little intimate setting. So please join us live if you haven't done so yet, and we'll see you next time on the Seller Roundtable. Thank you guys so much for being with us.
Hey, one more thing. We got to tell them how to reach Mark.
Oh yeah, Mark. Go ahead, Mark.
Mark, what's your contact information so folks can reach out to you?
Absolutely. So the best way to reach me is usually by email, which is mmiles@markmileslaw.com. But LinkedIn is where you can probably get to me most. So if you just type in Law Offices of Mark with a C, Miles, I will come up. There's not a whole lot of us. Mark with a C that's a lawyer. It's not a lot of those, even on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn and email is the best way to actually reach me. I do have a website, markmileslaw.com.
All right, and Mark with a C, and we'll put it in the show notes as well. Yeah. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for remembering that, Amy. Bad Andy.
Bad Andy.
Did you see those commercials? There used to be the Domino's commercials called Bad Andy. If you haven't seen them, go look them up on YouTube. That'll date me. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you next time. All right.